get started, can you just tell me a little bit about what Primavera does?
Sure. So Primavera's mission is to provide pathways out of poverty through safe, affordable housing, workforce development, and neighborhood revitalization. And we do community building, organizing, engagement through all of that work that we do. And so we could be working with folks who are living on the street or in their cars or in the desert, people that are experiencing homelessness, they don't have a safe place to call home, all the way through folks that are purchasing their first home and becoming financially empowered. We have an attempt to hire staffing service that supports people with barriers to employment, helps them to get into jobs and really focus on their assets. And we have a variety of programs for folks, getting them into housing, rapid rehousing. We have a men's shelter, a women's shelter. We have several drop-in programs, multiple rapid rehousing program where people identify the home they want to live in, and we're able to partner with them and support them with rental assistance. We have eviction prevention programs, utility assistance programs, and we also have our own rental housing portfolio. So for singles, couples, and families, and we really focus on people that are not making a living wage, maybe living on disability, SSI, or on Social Security. People that need housing, need safe, accessible, secure, healthy, green housing, but they can't pay the market rate. Otherwise, they'd be living on the street or doubled up with family and relatives. Right. So we have that whole rental housing portfolio, and then we do a lot of community building and engagement and organizing with marginalized constituent groups. So that gives you a feel for kind of everything that we do.
Yeah, really important work. Thank you.
Sure.
How has the spread of COVID-19 affected that work? What are you seeing on the ground right now?
Yeah, it's extremely diverse. We've had to change how we're working in terms of greater sanitation for our properties in a very ongoing way. We've even gotten foot pump hand washing stations outside of properties and programs that have high trafficked areas. For example, we provide free mail and message service to over 3,000 people. So that's a lot of people coming in and out. So we've had to really change up how we do the work. Some staff are able to work remotely. That can be challenging. We have a lot of single moms with children whose children are at home, right? Or they're in 3-generation families. And so they're taking care of mom. They have their children home. They're supposed to be homeschooling. Oh yeah, and they're also supposed to be working. So that's challenging. We had to increase our bandwidth, our ASA, get a lot more laptops, and put a whole new expanded IT infrastructure in. Because of some of the hoarding going on, we've had a hard time getting even sanitation items, gloves, masks, all of those things. So we have our own COVID-19 plan. And we had a pandemic flu plan, but it wasn't at the detail that we needed for COVID-19. So we expanded that out, developed it, put it in place. And so now, what does it mean for program participants? In the various programs that are serving folks that are experiencing homelessness, we're still keeping those open, and it's not virtual. So whether it's shelters or drop-in programs. However, our other programs, rapid rehousing, eviction prevention, utility assistance, our financial empowerment, homebuyer ed, all of the others are being done remotely. So that also has its challenges, although one of the staff shared with me, she said, because I'm now working remotely and I need to be able to serve the folks I'm working with, a lot of the single moms with children, the only time that they have to kind of talk is at night. So she said, I'm not doing my typical 8 or 9 to 5 job. Now I need to really be available when they need me. And so so that's kind of interesting from our side of working with participants. For the participant side, it's been everything. People that are still working, they're not making a living wage. They may or may not have health insurance. What do they do with their children? The moms are very afraid of having their children be in daycare or childcare. They may have family relatives that are older, but they're also afraid of exposing them. Many of the women had job interviews, and then those were completely canceled. So now they're in a place where they even don't have job options. Again, if they're working at home, trying to work at home and take care of their children and homeschool their children, they may not have technology. They may not have laptops. So it just gets multiplied. Our families have had a lot of time finding food. And if they're riding on a bus and they go to one grocery store and it doesn't have what they need, then they have to go and find another grocery store. So our staff are trying to kind of do that work to find out what do grocery stores have, where are they, so that the participants are only making one place. Or some of the restaurants, they're sharing free food. You know, if it's near where they live, how can they hook them up? So our staff try to do a lot of logistical work to minimize that level of stress and the time pressure, financial pressure on families. Women who are fleeing domestic violence, very fearful, feeling very vulnerable. And I think that's something very new, especially for the single moms with children, that sense of vulnerability, not being able to plan. What happens if I get sick? Who's going to care for my children? You know, how long am I going to be out of work? What if the stores empty out totally? What am I going to do? The level of fear and anxiety and vulnerability already, you know, people who are already marginalized and vulnerable have health disparities. That's just multiplied exponentially. So it's a really, really, really rough time.
Yeah. I think you touched on a lot of these in your answer, but I'm curious to dig a little deeper into how different the impact is for women, or how much worse it is, or you know what those implications are.
Well, in so many ways, we know that women don't make the same amount of money as men when they're working. We know that many of them aren't getting child support. We had one woman who was working in a school district as, you know, kind of a crossing guard, and she had a dream to purchase her own home. She's somebody who was fine. She was married, they had children. Well, then she and her husband got divorced because he was having affairs. And so then she got displaced. So she and the children are displaced. They don't have a place to live. A brother bought her a mobile home, but it was distressed, so it needed a lot of work. She still had this dream to buy a home, still was trying to do saving. She got promoted to be a bus driver. And you know, she's continued to try to work, to continue to have that dream. And then she was getting child support. Well, then her ex-husband died suddenly. So now she doesn't have the child support. Now she's in a distressed home. Now, you know, she's very unsure about what she's going to get paid. She's got the children. She doesn't have the infrastructure to do homeschooling with them. So, you know, women have a greater burden because of the lack of equity in this nation. And that, you know, it's historical. It goes from the founding of this nation. So when you combine it with all of that, and then realizing, you know, I'm the sole caretaker of my mom, or I'm the sole caretaker of my children, or of friends of my children because they've gotten kicked out of their home or they're couch surfing. You know, it's overwhelming. And you know, women, we feel so responsible. You know, even when the odds are against us, we're pretty powerful. And we see that with all the women that we work with. I mean, they do amazing work. This is just another level of vulnerability. And if they already are experiencing post-traumatic stress syndrome, could be a returning veteran, right? We work with a lot of veterans, including women. It could be because they fled a domestic violence situation. It could be because they were abused growing up. It could be because they've lived in poverty for multi-generations. No matter how hard they worked, they never knew if they had a safe place to call home. They never would know what was coming. And so now you have this pandemic. It's a pandemic that you can't see, and you can't really feel it till you get sick. And so the level of vulnerability and stress is just skyrocketing.
Yeah. So what can people do to help? You know, if somebody's watching this interview today, what can they do to support the work of Primavera and the people that you serve right now?
Sure. Well, right now, the easiest is to make an undesignated donation because, we historically we have meal teams, but we're really worried because a lot of the meal teams are vulnerable and compromised in their health themselves. And we're trying to really focus on sheltering and distancing and social distancing. So we're now needing to buy our own food and prepare it for our congregate sites. We're having to buy a lot of disinfectant, making sure that we're doing all the extra sanitizing at congregate sites or sites where we have a lot of people coming in and out. We're always looking, another area of support would be grocery store gift cards. That's something that we give to the women that are in our rapid rehousing or our shelter programs. We're able to give them, a shopping cart, and hopefully the staff can find out if there's actually food on the shelf. Sometimes there's food on the shelf, but it's so expensive and they're not used to using it, preparing with it, that they will often just not buy food if it's so expensive. So those are some of the areas right now that, because we've had to expand our IT infrastructure, purchase laptops. I said to staff, we put this COVID-19 plan in place. You don't worry about the money. That's part of my job. But we have to make sure that we are meeting people where they are. We're engaged with them. We're continuing to provide that equity of opportunity, especially right now, especially in the midst of a pandemic. There are also people that are, being blamed sometimes for COVID-19. So the other is just all the good energy that people can put out there. We really want to make sure that we're all challenging our biases and our assumptions and our stereotypes about who might have this and who might not have it. So all of that is important. But right now, in terms of our organization, we know that our earned revenue has gone way down because our temp to hire staffing service is only working part-time with crews. Our people in our rental housing, we've said you're not going to be evicted. We'll work out a payment plan for you. We don't want to create more homelessness, but we still have to pay the bills, right? We still have to maintain the units. We have to make sure that they're much more sanitized, the congregate areas are. We still have to make sure that we're meeting the standards that we should be meeting, right? To make sure that we're ensuring dignity and respect for our tenants and residents. So our work needs to continue to go on. It's just in a very, very different way. And we've got to invest, even if we don't know where the money is coming from. We have to step up and trust that the community will be there.
Yeah. Would you talk just a little bit more? You mentioned that there's some bias and some stereotype that's happening around who might have it. What are you seeing? And can we name that a little bit more clearly, because I imagine that's pretty widespread.
Right. Well, I would think if we had a larger Asian American population, we'd see some of the anti-Asian bias around COVID-19. We haven't heard of any here in Tucson. We have a very small Asian American population. But there are also fears that people who experiencing homelessness or people who are poor may be carriers more than somebody else, which is not necessarily true. We've had challenges with the distribution chains like everyone else in terms of even buying bulk food. And one of the county execs said to me, well, is that bias or is that the supply chain? And I said, well, thankfully, we're pretty sure it's the supply chain. It's not bias. You know, we've seen historically that people experiencing homelessness, single women, even youth, young people have been victims of violence because they experience homelessness or because they're very vulnerable. And if you're on the street and you're walking and you're trying to kind of care for yourself, you're very, very vulnerable. So we're just trying to stay on top of that as much as possible and make sure, for example, one of the things that we're working on with other shelter providers and the counties and the city is what happens when somebody in one of our shelters or our drop-in programs exhibits COVID-19. We have a great partnership with El Rio. You know, they can test them, but then if they come up positive, where do they go? And how do we make sure that there's a safe place for them to go where they'll have food, they'll have the medical care? Again, it's that sense of vulnerability, right? If you're on your own or you and your family, your children are on your own, you're a single mom, and you get sick, where do you go and who's going to care for your children? So really trying to focus on, again, like the rest of the nation, when we're trying to understand COVID-19, what are the facts? What do we know? How do we minimize the impact of COVID-19 on people that historically and still do not have equity of opportunity? They're vulnerable, they're marginalized, they have disparity, all of the health outcomes. How do we make sure that they are resourced as much as possible? Because nobody else is going to, right?
Right.
And if they don't have a support network, we've got to be part of that support network, right?
Yeah.
We have to make sure that we can support them in their goals and their plans and whatever they need to do to care for themselves and their family.
Are there any other super sheroes that you want to name or lift up in this moment?
Yeah. Well, I've been thinking a lot about my grandma, June Kreger. My grandma, June Kreger, was a single mom with children. Her first husband and baby died when they were trying to go out west, actually in a wagon. And they both got tuberculosis. And she had to bury them herself and then try to get herself back to the Midwest, Iowa, where she was from. She put her life back together. She remarried, had 2 kids. One was my mom. Her husband died again. She literally lived she was poor. And so what she did, and this was the beginning of the Depression, she would rent rooming houses and then rent them to students and then prepare all the food. So she was like a house mother. And I remember my mom telling me how she would get so frustrated because grandma would pick them up and move them every month or 2 because she'd find a better deal or a way to help the family survive better. I didn't know her during those times, but when I was a little kid, I lived in the Bay Area and she lived in a rooming house in Palo Alto, California. And it was a 2-story rooming house like one of the rooming houses Primavera has for women in transition. And she would walk to the grocery store and I would walk with her when I would visit, and she'd had her own little bedroom and bathroom, but they shared the kitchen. And I just remember she never felt like she was poor. She never acted like she was poor. She always saw the best in people. And it was such a joy for me to learn about what does it mean to be a strong, independent woman, to believe the best, to work really hard, and to be aware of your own assets. So here's this woman who, you know, went through so much pain and sadness and grief and vulnerability. But she always stepped up. She always cared about other people. She would always give to other people whether she had it or not. And she's clearly my shero. And, you know, she was alive during the pandemic of 1918. So I kind of wanted to write her a letter, right? And say, Grandma, tell me what it was like in your time. Tell me what it was like in that pandemic. But she's my shero during these times of fear, of vulnerability, of sadness, and of a time that requires us to be really strong and support those who are the most vulnerable in our community.
Yeah. What a touching story. Thank you for sharing that. She sounds amazing, and it sounds like you have inherited a lot of that same spirit and the work. So thanks.
Yeah.
Any last things you want to share before we wrap up today, Peggy?
Well, I think, you know, Tucson and Pima County, southern Baja Arizona, is such a generous community. You know, we have a high poverty rate, especially for single women and single women with children. But we have this incredibly generous community, and this this desire to not have people that are struggling to be kind of victims of charity, but to support them in who they are as full human beings. And you know, the Women's Foundation is one model of really investing in girls and women in our community till maybe one time we have full equity for all. So I guess my last feeling is remembering this vulnerable time, just a deep, deep feeling of gratitude, you know, and believing that if we keep gratitude in front of us and we keep equity of opportunity in front of us, and we keep kind of the strong women in our lives to help guide us, that will enable us to support the other strong women who are really trying to make it through this really fearful time of pandemic.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Peggy.